there are some items during the construction phase that are critical to this effort. And the biggest thing is coordination. So the key to it is during the design phase, as the commissioning authority, you've got to look at what is required of the tab firm. I always get the question, because we provide both services, isn't there an overlap in your services, especially if we're doing both on the same project? And we do a lot of that. Most people question that, and they say, isn't that a conflict of interest? Well, really it's not. We're providing an added value to the owner, and we're able to scale back our services and give them a very good value. But you've got to do it correctly, and I'm going to try to talk about that, whether you're the same firm or not. How do you get to where the two services complement one another, and you're not overlapping services if the tab firm does have control verification in their scope? So you need to look at that as you get into the design phase. What's in the specification for the tab firm? And is the tab firm on board? If they're not on board yet, then you have the opportunity to shape some of that scope as the commissioning authority if you're on board during the design phase. If they are already on board, then it may just be a careful coordination there of efforts. But my experience in the test and balance industry is most of the control verification that happens through the tab firms is not as rigorous as what is going to happen in the FPTs here. So that goes along with what I was saying. All right, so I'm going to go through what's in the AABC national standards and what's under AABC's purview that the tab firm should provide, okay? The tab firm should do a review for balanceability. I would highly recommend that you as the commissioning authority push to get them on board earlier, not just from a standpoint of adding services to their contract. It's that coordination element that we talked about earlier. And you can start coordinating those services and how your process as the commissioning authority dovetails with their services and how we're going to go about getting to the end of the finish line, so to speak. But the other part of this is the controls contractor. Everybody in here has perfect experiences on every job with the controls contractor, right? They're the best folks in the industry. They're actually really good folks, but unfortunately not all of them, especially in this day and age, have the greatest amount of experience, and they probably, unfortunately, cause us more headaches than really anybody else in the industry. That's another party that needs to be brought in here, but you really need to have the tab firm engaged in that discussion. I know a lot of commissioning authorities, and we do this as well as part of our commissioning process. We have a meeting with the controls vendor, especially during submittal time, and we say, okay, these are the design sequences. How are you going to meet this design intent? Okay, your sequences oftentimes, unfortunately, for various reasons, they're copied and pasted out of the design documents. Nobody else sees that, right? They take the designs and they just copy it into the shop drawings for the controls vendor. That just happens in our market, right? Okay, so you need to sit down with them and say, how are you going to achieve this? How are we going to get from point A to point B in verifying these sequences? Well, if the tab firm is going to be a part of that, and especially if they're contractually obligated per the specifications, they need to be a part of that discussion as well, okay? Because they're going to take a piece of it, as I'm going to show you here in a bit, and they're going to complement your services. So they need to be an integral part of the team, okay? Under their contract, if they follow the AABC requirements, they're supposed to go through with the temperature control contractor and ensure the system is operating within the design limits, okay? That's vague terminology, I understand that, and I'm going to drill down into that a little bit more. All the hardwired safeties, flow monitoring stations, well, that kind of goes without saying. Who's reading the flows on the job? The tab guy is, okay? Verify temperature, humidity, and pressure sensors are properly calibrated and reading correctly. Through our experience, we've found that the tab agency is actually the best firm to do this, okay? And I'm going to give you a few reasons why, but I'm going to do it here in a couple slides down the way. They need to be on board, though, and you need to understand those roles and relationships with respect to who's doing what between the controls contractor, the tab firm, and the commissioning authority, and it starts at the beginning. Confirming sequences of operation for all control modes are in compliance with the final approved control submittal. Well, you can do that in that control coordination meeting, okay? But the key to it is understanding what is everybody going to do. All right, so let's get into some of the meat of this right here. Component calibration, like we were talking about. After the testing and balancing's done, or let's back up, while they're doing their testing, is the test and balance firm, do they not have to look at the airflow stations? Are they not already measuring the airflow that's in those ducts for an airflow monitoring station? Are they not already verifying design outdoor air conditions? Yes, no? I think they should be. I hope they are. And it should be in their report. So while they're doing that, why are they not checking the controls and verifying that the airflow station is reading as they're measuring it? They are the best person to do that. Who else has the best knowledge and the equipment on the job to verify airflow, water flow, pressures, everything like that? The tab firm's hired to do that anyway, right? They're going to do it as part of their services. They may just not look at the BAS when they do it. I talk to a lot of tab firms in AABC as well as NEB, and they all say, well, yeah, we look at it, we just don't document it. Well, why not document it? If they document it and they give you that piece of paper as part of the commissioning process, that saves you guys steps. Otherwise, you're going to be asking the controls contractor to do it. I don't know about you guys, but the controls vendors in my area, they don't keep up very good calibration on their equipment, not like a tab firm does. So when I ask them to bring a thermometer out and check their sensors, it's usually hit or miss whether we're going to get a good quality instrument out there or a technician that knows what they're doing to come out and verify calibration, even though we all know they should. It's just reality, it doesn't happen. So who's going to have that calibrated equipment? Who's going to have the knowledge? The test and balance firm is. So if we coordinate in advance and we say, okay, Mr. Test and Balance guy, you give me a sheet that says, these are all the sensors, I verified all the temperature, pressure, humidity, whatever it may be, airflow sensors, ahead of functional testing, and you've got good assurance, and maybe you sample some of that. Maybe that's part of the scope for overseeing testing and balancing. I can't say one way or the other. It's really the relationship you have with the tab firm and what you have under your scope with the owner. But you have to gain that level of trust and get that information from the tab firm. So I want to move on. We talked about point verification and dynamic testing, but I want to get into the terminal unit verification. In your markets, series fan-powered boxes. This is one of the biggest things as I poll folks throughout the country. I mean, I'm real involved in ASHRAE. I hear nobody knows how to set up a series fan-powered box. So I want to go through what a test and balance firm, if they're truly verifying controls and they're going to do their job, more so than just balancing the dampers on the discharge of a fan-powered box, what should they be doing to set this up? And I may ruffle some feathers here, but I'm going to just tell you my opinion for what it's worth. So you go through, and anybody can go through and set the fan speed, right? Any good tab firm should be able to do that, whether it's an ECM motor, PSC motor. You may have to throttle the damper. We're not seeing a whole lot of that anymore. But they're going to go through and balance the dampers, balance the outlets. So do we all agree that you've got to have some primary airflow there when they're doing the balancing? Everybody else seen what I've seen, which is about a 20% split on those ECM motors especially, if you have no primary airflow. So first and foremost, you've got to put some primary in there. What we recommend and what we try to do on our projects is you go ahead and introduce primary. It may not be fully calibrated, but you get it close, okay? How many people in here advocate using the ports from the manufacturer to measure airflow on the flow cross? I'm not going to raise my hand because I don't, but I want to see how many folks think it is. Okay. So how many people know how you should neutralize a box? Anybody in here know how you should neutralize a box? Toilet paper, cardboard flapper, vane anemometer. Okay, at least we got a few people that have seen somebody doing it right. Unfortunately, what I have seen from a lot of folks that really don't know what they're doing is they take the port, they correlate it to the chart, they may adjust the K factor, they may adjust the duct size in the control system, unfortunately, because there's a number of tab firms that just don't dive into the controls enough. But what if your tab firm were to go into that controller and document everything that was not a default parameter in that package controller? And I'm still talking about a series fan powered box here, but I'm crossing the range into any package controller. What would that give you as a commissioning authority? And more importantly, what would it give you as an owner? Okay, it would give you the setup of that box. And I'm not seeing the controls contractors giving that to the owners. So I think the key there is that the test and balance firm does it. But more importantly, back to the Siemens, or I'm sorry, not Siemens, but a series fan-powered box. When you're doing this, you've got to set the K factor, the duct size, the operational parameters, the min and max airflows. If you've got different heating and cooling min and max, you've got to put those things in there. And then you've got certain parameters, whether you've got electric reheat, hydronic reheat, maybe some other things to achieve occupancy scenarios and things like that. Who's documenting those settings and putting them and giving them over to the owner? Are you doing it as a commissioning agent? I don't see too many doing it. That's what I'm going to advocate you ask for from your tab firm. You want to have them part of the commissioning process, and you want to complement your services. You need to ask for this, and this is just a regular VAV. And some of you, if you recognize the various control vendors, you'll be able to pick out immediately which one it is. But you need something like this, that if that controller goes bad, what was changed in that controller? What are the critical operating parameters in that controller to be able to get it back to the way that it was set up by the tab firm, okay? And who's better to do that? The tab firm, in my mind, is the best one to do that, is to go through the box. If you were to use the commissioning authority to go through every box and check all this information, you're doing redundant work with the tab firm, okay? So if you were to document all this and the tab firm were to give this to you, if you choose, you could go through and audit some of it to see if it was right. But you're really going to check this and see if it's working at a system level, right? When you go through and check your air handling unit. I can look at an air handling unit system when I drive it to full cooling or full heating, and I can tell if these boxes are working reasonably, okay? But more importantly, I'm going to show you another document that if your tab firm gives it to you, you can tell almost immediately if something is not where it should have been when they verified it through tab. So they need to go through and here and set this up. Back to my example of the series fan-powered box. In that particular application, you've got to make sure that those boxes were neutralized correctly. Otherwise, your primary airflow may be off. And that's one of the only ones that's really challenging to get this calibration or this coefficient set up correctly. So what I would encourage you to do as the commissioning authority is spend some of that tab verification time that the owner's paying you for and go out and see how the tab firm is setting up those boxes. Ask them if they have a written procedure. They may not, but they may. And if they do, ask them to show you how they're going through and setting it up so that you have a good understanding and a level of trust of how they're setting up those systems. And then more importantly, when they give you the tab data before the functional testing, because we all know they're supposed to turn over at least their draft data, right, for review of the system, look at their traverses, their total system traverse. And I'm going to show you another document here in a minute that you really should get. We call it a system profile. You can call it various things. But it's basically how are the boxes performing relative to the set point that they put in there, relative to the measured airflow. If you have that information, you can tell almost at a glance whether the system is operating reasonably well, okay? Because the traverse airflow should match up with what the boxes think they're doing. And if the set points are set correctly, your damper positions and things like that should seem reasonable relative to the positions in the system and the demand on the system. Does anybody disagree with me on that? Okay, good. All right. So ask for this, or ask for some variation of this from your tab firm, and the size, set points, and coefficient aren't always enough. I know that some people give that, but you might want to get down to a little bit more. What's it going to take to get that back to the original scenario? All right, system tuning. I'm going to go through this right here. This is the document I really want to focus on. So the airflow profile. Does everybody in here know how a tab firm, or even you as the commissioning authority, or the control firm for that matter, should go through and set up a static pressure set point in a VAV system? Lick their finger and stick it in the air. Guess, 2 inches sounds good. 1.5 inches. I've had controls guys tell me that. We just guessed. Okay. The real way to do it is you drive everything to full cooling or maximum flow, whatever that may be, but that's typically cooling, at least down where I live in Houston. Maybe different up north. But you're going to have your design maximum airflow here. So you have a design maximum airflow. Your actual maximums were probably at the time of testing and balancing. You could require them to go back through and read it out again, but I think that's a little bit of overkill. But you want to know, relative to when they balanced it, how close they were. It's just nice to have everything on one sheet of paper. More importantly, though, is the displayed CFM and the BAS. You want to compare that with the design, and is it achieving it or not? Well, if you set your set point too high, you're probably going to get your airflow, and it's all going to look good. But these damper positions on the far right-hand column, at least in this example, probably going to be backed off, okay? You may have some, the worst case ones are down in the 50%. If that's the case, then your set point's probably a little bit too high, and they can start backing that off. Ideally, what we suggest, and there's varying opinions on this, is that you want your worst case damper at around 90%, okay? You don't want it at 100%. You want it at least trying to control a little bit, but if you know anything about damper fidelity and airflow control with dampers, you're going to know that, above 75%, you're not getting a whole lot, okay? 75 to 80%, it just depends on the application. So if you get your worst case one at 90, at least you know the box is still trying to control. It's pretty close to full open, but that's going to be the best that you can do. If you've got diversity in your system, everybody know what diversity is? Okay. If you've got diversity in the system, you've got to account for that, and you can see that some of that's done here. And your tab firms should know that. How else did they test the capacity on their coils if they didn't realize there was diversity in the system? So that's another check that you can see off of this document right here. You see, did they take that into account whenever they did their testing? And which boxes or terminal units did they choose to do that on? And was it the right choice? So you can get a lot of things from this one snapshot here. And then you can also see this static pressure happens to be a little high, but this happens to be a dual duct unit. You want to see, is that reasonable? The other part that we advocate, and I don't know that I have it in here, I don't, is doing this at minimum. How many folks have seen the tab firm drive the terminal units all down to minimum flow? Do you do it as the commissioning authority? I would hope so. What we ask of our folks, and if we're working with another tab firm, is that they give us this data at minimum also. And it serves a variety of purposes. Number one, it shows you what the system's going to do when it goes down. But number two, it shows you the low point of the system, the lower operating static pressure set point. Even if you don't have a static pressure reset sequence in your sequence of operations, you now have the data, or the owner has the data later on, to where they know the operating range that in which they can operate, okay? So it's very, very good information to know how far down you can go. So if you can get the maximum and the minimum relative to the system, you're doing pretty well. This happens to be in heating on a dual duct system, and you'll notice that things tend to, on a dual duct system at least, they, especially if you have one fan, you're going to end up with some set points that may go a little bit further out than you would like, but you've got to kind of watch that. I want to talk about dual duct systems for a moment too. What you need to make sure of is everybody can figure out the max cooling side. That's pretty easy. That's kind of just like on a fan-powered box or a VAV. Everybody can usually figure out the max heating. It's the minimums that make the big difference in a dual duct system. And the tab firm usually, if you can get them to even read that, you're doing pretty well sometimes, because oftentimes they argue that's not part of the system. I don't need to check that. But if you can get them to do that and ensure that the minimum is reading properly and controlling, and you can do it through using these types of sheets, if you can get them to fill out those profile sheets, they've effectively done part of the FPT. I'm not saying you're not going to do it again, but you're ensuring that your boxes are hitting the crossover point and that they're controlling effectively, and you've effectively done a control verification on your box controller. Anybody argue with that? If you've driven through that, especially if you drive it by temperature. Now, you as the commissioning agent may want to be there while they're doing some of them, especially if you have a sampling arrangement. But in all honesty, this is no different than a VAV box or a series fan-powered box and checking out the controls. It just takes one more step, and you have to work that out with the tab firm in advance. All right, so when we get up to the air handling unit controllers, this is the part where it starts getting a little bit muddy in my mind. You have to say, okay, where's the tab firm going to start or stop, and where am I going to pick up as the commissioning authority? And in our mind, what we suggest, especially if you have a closely coordinated relationship, the tab firm will assist and do the point verification, as we talked about earlier, on the unit, and they can do it either in the presence of the commissioning authority or not, just depending on the level of trust you have. But when they do that, everybody in here done a point verification before? Maybe? Okay. If you go through and you check every single point, and I'm not just talking about sensors, I'm talking about every single physical DI, DO, AI, AO to a control board. Have you not done a very rough control verification? At least with respect to the digital inputs and outputs. Okay, if you trip a safety sensor, I mean, you're going to see the unit shut down, and if you don't, you're probably not ready for functional testing. So if the tab firm is doing that, they're in essence doing, I hate the term pre-functional, but they are doing a pre-functional check, are they not? And they hopefully will flesh out some of those issues that maybe the control contractor didn't check. But do they need to go through and do a full-bore functional test? I think it's a little bit overkill, but that's my opinion. We've had folks suggest, and we've even had functional tests from commissioning agents given to our tab guys and said, can you go through this and do it ahead of me? Well, there's a lot of tab folks out there that are going to think they're doing the commissioning agent's job, right? Is that the right approach? And then we've also had it the other way around where we wrote a full bore control verification that was even more in depth than the commissioning authority's FPT, or I've even had a commissioning authority, unfortunately, take and put a cover letter on our control verification that our tab folks did. Both of those applications are not the right way to handle this. So what we found in our experience is the best balance here when you get into we're talking about air handling units here, and where you actually have to do some programming, not just terminal or package controllers, is to have the tab firm do the point verification and try to flesh out some of those basic sequences, and then they stop. The commissioning authority takes over from there with their full bore functional test. Okay? And that's kind of the line in the sand. So if you looked at that in macro terms of the system, let's go through all the elements again. Who's verified all the controls on the terminal units? Well, the tab firm has. And they've given you documentation of setup. And if they've done that appropriately, they've gone through. But let's face it, they're package sequences. If you've tested one and many of the parameters, you understand what's got to be there. If everybody's looked at that and the tab firm's gone through it, it's pretty much tested. And you're going to see it on the system side anyway if you have some anomalies, or you should see it. So that part's taken care of. You don't need to go back through the terminal units. You go through and you have the tab firm verify the calibration and the point-to-point on the air handling unit system. Okay, so you know all your calibration's right, your sensor's right, and they've fleshed out any major issues as they go through doing their checkout to get you to the point of functional testing. If that was done on every one of your jobs, how much of your time would be saved? I would hope a lot, because I know the biggest delays we have, at least when we're not doing the testing and balancing, is fixing all those little problems along the way when we come to do functional testing on a system. All right, so there's an example of a point verification form. The last thing I really want to talk about here is how should you use the testing and balancing firm when you're doing functional testing? Who thinks that they should be there the whole time? Okay? Who thinks that they shouldn't be there at all? Anybody? Okay. I think the best way to use them is to segregate out in your functional tests the parts that you may need them to take measurements. We routinely verify that the coil control valves are shutting off all the way, and that as we open up that valve, we're seeing somewhat some linearity in the flow. Well, unless the commissioning agent's carrying around a water meter with them or an ultrasonic meter, you really can't test that. But typically the tab guy's got one on site, okay? So we oftentimes will use the tab personnel for that part. If we question a sensor, if we question the way something's reading, we know that the tab firm has calibrated instrumentation on site. So we'll utilize them for that. So we kind of try to break those elements out and put them up at the front of the functional test where we can release the tab guys thereafter to go about their business. And that's the part that I kind of advocate. You can always call them back, because otherwise you're paying, or somebody's paying, for dual services there, okay? If you force them to be there and they've already gone through and done a verification, at least to meet the standard, then they're in essence losing money, and they're probably going to get upset about it and ask for a change order, okay? And we've all been there. If you put it in the specification that they have to be there during the entire commissioning process, then the tab cost just went through the roof, okay? Because they're just going to be sitting there twiddling their thumbs most of the time. And they may offer some good insight and things like that, but is it really worth it to the owner through their fees for something that you could call them on the phone and get the answer to? That's the question I throw out there. So that's our take on how you should utilize them on a basic air handling unit system. What else should you do, though, when you're checking it out to kind of verify what they did? As you're going through there, I've got some good things in this slide. One of the main things is documenting operation of the system across the entire operating range. And it's not just a matter of send me a bunch of documentation and make sure all the check marks are in the boxes. You've got to get out there at least a little bit before the functional test and see, is the system really where it should be? You've got to request the documentation from the testing and balancing firm. You need to look at the airflows they tested. You need to look at the data that I showed up here, which is the system profiles, terminal unit control configurations, and anything else that you may need, as well as the point verification and the calibration. And you may even want to be there for some of that, because that leads into the functional testing. If you see all of that, and especially if you're there during the point verification and calibration with the control contractor, I think you're going to have a pretty good level of comfort as to whether you're ready to proceed with the functional testing or not. So when you get into it, the key elements on a VAV system is not only just the basic sequencing, but how many people in here systematically drive that system from maximum down to minimum incrementally? How many folks do that? You? I would recommend that everybody do that, because there are things that you will see at maximum and there are things that you'll see at minimum, and you might even get lucky and hit it at the midpoint. But what you won't flesh out unless you incrementally do it over time is some of the loops and things like that. I mean, I've seen control loops where they work at maximum. That's usually where they're tuned. But where does the system normally operate? It normally operates at minimum, at least if the system's designed correctly. That's what it's intended to do for energy savings, right? So if we go all the way down to minimum, maybe they did a secondary tuning and they tried to split the difference. Rarely do I ever see a control vendor, though, take it across the full range, incrementally over time. And I fleshed out a lot of problems and things like that that would have eliminated customer callbacks later on by going through that step-down process. And it takes a little bit longer to do that, but it's better in the end on a VAV system. And as you're doing that, you can watch the boxes, or the terminal units, and compare it to that data you got from the test and balance firm at maximum and minimum. See where they are at the max, and then watch them track down, then you can get a pretty good feel as to whether that system is working properly without having gone through and done a checkout or an FPT on every single individual box, because usually that just drives the cost through the roof. So, this is a very good slide. don't think I included in the other one, but there are a couple points that I want to touch on in here while we're going there because we have some time. How many folks in here test the systems outside of automatic sequences in local or hand control? A few people do. I would highly suggest, especially with the advent of the newer package controllers, as well as the fan array type systems and things like that have gotten more complex, that you test it. The control sequence from the engineer, the design engineer may not address it, and that's something you got to look at during the design review stage. But how many times do you come back to a job, get called back, and unfortunately the maintenance staff, they couldn't figure out the automatic operation, so they put it in hand. And then the system goes crazy, or it just doesn't perform, okay? So, or what if they put it in hand and there's some relay interlocks or something else like that, and they just shut the system down? Of course, this is at 2 o'clock in the morning on Saturday night or something like that in an operating hospital, for example. If you don't test those things, you can't reasonably tell the owner, hey, we've tested every scenario. And so that's something that I see as a common oversight. And we even ask the tab firm, and if we're doing the tab work, we'll even verify that, some of those sequences as part of that pre-functional point verification check to make sure some of those interlocks are in there. If you have some complex scenarios like that, at that point, I would recommend that you give your FPT, a copy of your FPT to the controls contractor and or the tab firm before the time of the functional test and say, hey, look, I'm really going to check some of these sequences, and these are outside the normal automatic control. You guys may want to go through and check this out. And just make sure, because this is what I'm going to be looking for, and if you've got any questions, let me know. All right, this is the variable volume control verification I was talking about earlier. This doesn't apply. Owner training. I'll touch on this. How many people in here do a commissioning agent / tab / AE owner training session with their owners? Couple? Okay. I would highly suggest that if you don't do this, that you try to do it in the future. And there's a few reasons why. How many times as part of the testing and balancing / commissioning / controls tuning process do we make changes, or I won't say we, the controls vendor makes changes at the suggestion of the commissioning authority to get the system into optimized operation? It happens on almost every project that we do. Where is that documented? It's not in the design documents. It's not going to be in the O&Ms. It's probably not even going to be in the testing and balancing report, which was our fallback earlier to get the controls information that we didn't have anywhere else. So where can you give that knowledge? Well, you can put it in the FPT. I don't know about you guys, but I don't see too many owners sitting around reading my 12,000-page commissioning reports, though. They go to it when they have a problem, and oftentimes, unfortunately, they have trouble finding the information, and they call us anyway. What if you were to sit down, though, with their operations staff and their BAS staff, if they're separate, or maybe their energy management staff, and you were to go through the high points of that FPT, some of the things that weren't clear sequences, that weren't part of the design element, that you had to work through some challenges to get the system operating per the design intent. What if you were to tell them that up front? You'd save them a lot of money, right? And you probably would secure some future work. At least that's been my experience. And you're going to develop some trust with the owner in doing that. So that's one thing that when we're putting together commissioning specifications and we're working with the owner at the beginning of the project, we try to make sure that if it's not included in the Division 1 specs, because that really covers what the contractor's going to do, that we try to put it into the commissioning specification to hold a design / commissioning training session, okay? And it doesn't have to be long, but you have to get the buy-in of the designer, preferably the buy-in of the tab firm, as well as the commissioning firm. And everybody sits down and goes through the basic sequences and talks about the things and educates about the things that weren't in the design documents or not readily apparent in the commissioning documents. I'm sure you could find them if you knew what you were looking for. But how many owners are that sophisticated? So that's another value-added deal that you can put into your services. This slide is still relevant. How many people, gentlemen back here already said it, but how many people have come behind to do a functional test? Controls guy, you call the controls guy, and he said, yeah, the system's ready for you. And of course, the general contractor said the owner's moving in tomorrow. And I really need you out here in the morning, giving you about 8 hours notice. Says, I really need you to get out here. Everything's ready, it's been ready, it's blowing cold air. I need you to come out and do the functional test because we got to get the system turned over. And you get out there, and you got a great tab report, like you said before. You got a controls contractor that gives you all the startup forms, which in my experience never happens, but let's play theoretical scenario here, where they gave you all the right documentation, and you go through and you do your functional test, and nothing works. Why didn't it work? Well, let's break it down again. Everybody looked at their individual pieces of the pie, but nobody looked at the pie as a whole, right? The controls guy looked at his logic, and he tested individual loops. The tab firm may have gone through and looked at individual sensors, but they really didn't pay attention to the overall sequence as a whole, or maybe they didn't even do that verification. Maybe they just balanced the air and the water, okay? But they've got a great tab report, and they were a good firm. They did everything they were supposed to do. That doesn't mean the building's going to work. And I can tell you, in the experience that I have, going through doing point verifications, both on the tab side as well as on the commissioning side, we've had projects that they said were ready for commissioning, that we found over a 50% failure rate in the point verification. Points not going to the right spot, not labeled correctly, not going to the right sensor, multiple temperature sensors. When they averaged them all together, it was fine. But if you went through each one individually and failed them, they weren't even going to the right point, okay? One sensor that was out compared to the calibration of two others, if you've got 3 different averaging sensors on the same coil. Well, the numbers looked reasonable. Nobody picked up on it. Everybody did their checkout, but it was still wrong, okay? So if you don't do these elements, either as the tab firm or as the commissioning agent or hold the control contractor to do it, all of these scenarios can come into play here. And we see it every day, and it plagues owners every single day. So the key to it is it's a team effort. And whether one party does it, and you verify it as the commissioning authority, or whether you bring the tab firm in to assist, which is the way that we advocate, and the way that AABC advocates. Control verification is a team effort. And if you follow the specification from AABC on total system balancing, you should achieve your results here with minimal, I won't say anything's perfect, but hopefully you minimize and mitigate the effects of these types of things. So.